right, so let's start. When your body requires energy, it has to burn the food substances that you have in your body. So the food substances, of course, are different. You have proteins, carbohydrates, and then you have lipids. These are the ones that can be burnt or broken down to produce energy. And that process of breaking down food substances to release energy is what we call cellular respiration. We earlier on noted that cellular respiration takes place in 3 stages. This is not to mean that you only have 3 reactions. That is not the case. You have, actually, for each stage, you have a series of reactions happening. And these are catalyzed using different enzymes. Okay, so the 3 stages are glycolysis, Krebs cycle, and then electron transport system. And then there is another one that we also looked at as a separate session, what we call the link reaction. Okay, so the link reaction, we say that it links glycolysis to Krebs cycle. So we have already looked at glycolysis, we have looked at the link reaction, we have looked at Krebs cycle. Now we are moving to that last stage of cellular respiration. Okay, cellular respiration. So that's what we are going to cover. We are going to know what cellular respiration is and what does it give us, what is its role, what reactions are actually involved, what compounds, what enzymes are involved, and how is ATP actually generated. These are questions that we should be able to answer at the end of this presentation. So the first thing that you need to note is about the naming of what we call the electron transport system, or what we call the electron transport chain. It has several names. So far you have heard of 2, electron transport chain, electron transport system. But we also call it the cytochrome system. Okay, we call it the cytochrome system because eventually you will see the cytochromes coming in. Proteins that have a prophetic group called iron. Iron is the prophetic group in cytochromes. Okay, cyto means whole cell, and then chrome means color. So this iron in these proteins actually give the color. Okay, so that is cytochrome system. That's the other name for electron transport system. So we have just said that it's the last stage, okay, and produces the highest number of ATP molecules. We shall see how many ATP molecules are actually produced. What you have here, in essence, is the electron transport system or the electron transport chain. Okay, that is what it looks like. And if you know the roles of each of those things that you see there, it means that you'll be able to know the whole process of electron transport system. It looks simplified, isn't it? Yeah, it shouldn't be very difficult to get to understand. So first, let us know where the electron transport system takes place. We know that for glycolysis takes place in the cytosol, and for Krebs cycle, it takes place in the mitochondrial matrix. And now when it comes to electron transport system, what you can call ETC, it happens in the inner membrane of the mitochondria. So the mitochondria, if you remember what we looked at in cytology, we said that the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. This means that it is used to generate energy. It's used to generate energy. So that energy, of course, is in the form of ATP. Now, we are now coming to understand its actual role. In cytology, we just mentioned that it is the mitochondria is an organelle that is used to produce energy in the form of ATP. Now, this is where we are now looking at how the mitochondria produces this energy. Okay, already in Krebs cycle we saw the reactions there and how ATP is produced there. So here we will see that the mitochondria has double membranes, the inner and the outer membrane. And then in between the inner and outer membrane, you have space, what we are calling the intermembrane space. These spaces here, those are the intermembrane spaces. Okay. Now this is the inner membrane. The inner membrane is actually folded. The inner membrane of the mitochondria is folded. And this is actually an adaptation that increases the surface area for which respiratory reactions can take place, especially electron transport reactions can take place. Okay, and then of course it has another unique adaptation, the enzyme complexes. The inner membrane of the mitochondria have what you call the enzyme complexes that are named 1, enzyme complex 1, enzyme complex 2, enzyme complex 3, enzyme complex 4, even 5. Okay, though you will say that in some resources you have the complexes ending at 4, but they can be 5. Okay, so what do these complexes do? Is that of course they receive electrons and then they move these electrons from one carrier to the other. And the carrier that we are talking about here are these complexes. That's all. That's what happens. Okay. So where are these electrons coming from? The ones that we are carrying from one complex to the other. They are coming from these molecules. Nicotinamide adenine nucleotide. Okay. When we have this H added, it means we have the reduced version of that molecule. Okay, and then we have flavin adenine dinucleotide. When you see this H, it means that we are having the reduced version. Okay, the reduced version, it means it has received the hydrogen atoms. Okay, yes. So it is this movement of electrons from one energy, from one carrier or one transporter to the other is what actually creates the energy in the form of ATP. And we are going to see why is that happening. Okay? So the passage of electrons until it is accepted finally by oxide form water is what ultimately represents electron transport system. This is the point here. Okay? In essence, the electron transport chain involves what we call redox reactions. Reduction oxidation reactions. That's what we are meaning. That we have compounds that are getting reduced and we have compounds that are getting oxidized. And that's why we are saying electron transport system basically consists of this. Okay? As the electrons are moving from one compound to the other, we are having reduction and oxidation taking place at the same time. And what are the things carrying these electrons? Remember the two that we have just talked about. Okay, the nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide, then the flavin adenine dinucleotide. Those ones you already know. They come from other processes. That is Krebs cycle and also glycolysis. That's where you get these reduced versions of these molecules. And then the other carriers or transporters are coenzyme 2 and then cytochromes. I've already explained what cytochromes are. Okay, and then these transporters or one carrier and one carrier to the other. Those are what you can term as the respiratory chain. So if we talk about respiratory chain, that is what we basically mean there. Okay, so this is like a chain of carriers, a chain of transporters from one complex to the other. Okay, so what basically happens is that when you you have electrons, when they are moving from one carrier to the other, they are moving from a carrier that has a higher energy level to a carrier that has a lower energy level. And when they move like that, high to low, energy is usually given. Energy is released. But if you're moving from low to high, then you need energy. Energy is used. So in this case, moving from electrons moving from one carrier to the next, energy is released because we are moving from a higher energy level to a lower energy level. Okay, and that energy that is released actually is used to pump protons. Protons are hydrogen ions. Okay, and these protons are pumped into the intermembrane space, and that is what creates a gradient. That's what creates a gradient. Okay, so you have a gradient of hydrogen ions, and we are calling it the electrochemical gradient. The hydrogen ions are the ones that are responsible for that, or the protons are the ones responsible for that. And eventually, you basically have the inside being negative compared to the outside. And this pumping is actually carried out by the complexes that we have already talked about, complex 1 and 2 and 5. And that is why you are having these protons with this arrow, meaning that they are being pumped out. Okay, so we are going to see what happens. Of course, I can mention it here that these hydrogen ions or these protons get accepted by oxygen, and then that is how you have water. That is how you have water as one of the products of respiration. Okay, so the protons end up being accepted by oxygen and having water being formed. But like I said, as these electrons are moving from one carrier to the other, energy is released. And we are saying that this energy can be used to pump electrons across into the intermembrane space. But we are also saying here that some of that energy is actually used to synthesize ATP. And ATP is formed when you have adenosine diphosphate combining with an inorganic phosphate, which you often represent as Pi, to form adenosine triphosphate. Okay, so we are basically saying that electrons that are carried by these components, we call them, for example, or we can call them high energy carrying molecules, the NADH and the NADH2. These are the ones that carry these electrons. And remember, these electrons are actually coming from the other processes of Krebs cycle and also electrolysis. So what basically happens is that you have these complexes 1 and 5. You remember? Yes. So let's see how are these electrons handed to these complexes. NADH donates these electrons to complex 1, and then complex 1 delivers them to coenzyme Q. And then with FAD H2, you have the electrons entering through complex 2. Okay, enzyme complex 2, and then this also transfers the electrons to coenzyme Q. Okay, and then the electrons from coenzyme Q flow to enzyme complex 3, and then from 3 you go to cytochrome C, and then eventually to enzyme complex 4. Okay, and that is where they actually get accepted by oxygen to form water that I had talked about. So that is how these electrons move. NADH complex 1, FAD H2 complex 2, that the one from NAD, when they enter complex 1, they are connected to coenzyme Q, and then also those that enter through complex 2 also eventually end up at coenzyme Q. Okay, and then from coenzyme Q to 3, okay, and then from 3 to 4, and then that is where you have these being accepted by water, by oxygen to form water. Okay, so the energy released during the transfer is used to pump hydrogen ions that create that gradient, and I've explained that. And then the protons flow back through the ATPase, generating ATP. Okay, and that ATP is now the energy that we want. Okay, and that process is what we call oxidative phosphorylation. Okay, so this is a complex image that can depict what basically happens. You see this gives out these protons, complex 1. You can see this is complex 1. And then you have the third H2 gives out to complex 2. Both of them give to coenzyme Q, and then coenzyme Q now gives to enzyme complex 3. You can say that enzyme complex 2 is actually small compared to 1 and 2 and 4. Okay, and then from 3 now goes to cytochrome C before going to complex 4, where we also have cytochrome A and cytochrome A. Is it A2 or A3 here? This is A3 actually. Okay, and then you have this. This is where you also produce, where you actually produce what? The ATP protons being pumped, and then generating sufficient energy for synthesizing ATP through the process of oxidative phosphorylation. So in summary, we are basically saying that you have a NADH entering the electron transport system through enzyme complex 1 that we are calling carrier 1 here, and this produces 3 ATP molecules, and then you have find H2, this is a 2 here, and this enters at enzyme complex 2, what we call carrier 2 here. It produces 2 ATP molecules. Okay, and then you have overall you are producing 34 ATPs, 34 ATP molecules from the electron transport system. Okay, so that has been our presentation on the electron transport system, where we have looked at how electrons are carried from one carrier to the other, and then releasing energy, and that energy being sufficient for ATP formation. We also saw how electrochemical gradient is created by pumping the hydrogen ions, and in the hydrogen ions finally being accepted by oxygen to form water. But also that process gives you